Oh, great. So thank you everyone for joining us today for our part 2 of our Policy Surveillance Program Advanced Webinar Series. Part 1 was about a month ago. Hopefully you were able to attend. We had some difficulties with the recording for that one, so we will be sending out recordings of both Part 1 from last month and Part 2 from today as soon as we have them available, most likely tomorrow morning. So they'll be ready for your review and ready for any further inquiry into these topics that you have. But today, we are going to be talking about question development, and which is the next step in the process of policy surveillance. So we might as well get started. That's what we're here for today. So today's learning objectives, we're going to be talking about, in regard to question development, we'll talk about how to draft coding questions. Coding questions are a crucial element of the entire policy surveillance process. And so in doing so, we're going to understand the goals of question development and how they play into what types of questions you develop and how those questions are structured. So those are our learning objectives for today, but a quick overview of how we got to where we are right now. So last webinar in part 1, we talked about defining the scope of the project. So the scope of the project is basically is answering the question of what you are trying to get out of this project. Who is your audience? What gaps in the literature and the research are you trying to fill? Are you going to be doing this project longitudinally, so looking at these laws over a series of time, or are you going to do it cross-sectionally, looking at various jurisdictions at one point in time? And then as well, other questions of scope will then come from, and your actual definition and redefinition of the scope, remember it's an iterative process, your scope is never fully defined, will come through in your background research. So the background research is a crucial first step of the policy surveillance process. It plays into defining your scope as well as going into what we're going to talk about today in developing coding questions. So in conducting background research, we generally write 2 memos, as we discussed last time. The first memo is just a general background memo, which will sort of give you an understanding of the state of the law, the state of the research in that area, how big is this area that you want to look into, where does it exist in state level, federal level, whatever sort of jurisdictions you're looking at, how is it structured generally, and how is the law and that policy, how is it played out over time. So that background memo, you and your researchers will compose and give you that idea, is especially important if you are not experts in that area going into it. That background memo leads directly into writing what we refer to as a policy memo. So the policy memo is where you take a sample of, we usually do about 5 jurisdictions, and we want to look at this specific area of law, whatever area of law that you are looking at as part of your project, and we're going to go into the details of how that law or policy area is structured in those 5 specific sample jurisdictions. So that then will give us, from the background memo, we have a general idea of the law and that policy across the whole country, or whatever sort of, if you're doing something global, then across the entire world. And then the policy memo gives us a specific rundown of how those laws are structured and the important elements in those specific sample of jurisdictions. And so what all this background research will then lead to is developing the coding questions, because basically from there we'll be able to consult with our subject matter expert and develop our coding questions. And again, as you can see in the circle, quality control pervades all aspects. We want to make sure that we are getting the best research done as possible. So in our background research, we generally here at our shop, when we have 2 researchers on a project, we'll have each of them write their own background memos, so then we can review and make sure we get the whole understanding of the area. And similarly, we have 2 researchers each write a policy memo of different jurisdictions, so we have a total of 10 jurisdictions that we've written these detailed policy memo on, so we have a general idea of the sort of state of the law, the crucial elements, the crucial variations, which will lead directly into understanding what kind of coding questions we're going to develop out of that background research. So today, in going for the specifics of developing coding questions, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Marcelo, who's going to be discussing the details of this process with you today. As you can see here, we are highlighting, we are now in the developing coding questions part of the policy surveillance process, which is the part that we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this webinar today. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. So we're going to move to the next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about developing coding questions, as Josh mentioned. So coding questions are used to structure your data set. So that may not mean much to you right now, but I can tell you from experience, once your data set is created, you can look back and see how you got there from your coding questions. So this is a huge step in the process and a very important one. So the importance of these coding questions is that they capture features of the law from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So in doing a policy surveillance process like ours that covers so many jurisdictions, it's important to come up with questions that are going to cover all the variation that comes up in all the different jurisdictions that you're covering. So the goals of developing coding questions are to track state law in question and answer format. As you all know, law can be very complex. And breaking it down into question and answer format helps you get a handle on the complexities of the laws that exist in our system. And we're also, this is a very important point, the second bullet is something that's going to come up a lot and you're going to get tired of hearing me say it, but we're creating questions that are measuring law rather than interpreting it. Because when we get to interpretation, we're reaching conclusions from our own thinking, and really we're just trying to look at what's actually written in the law. So while you're researching your remaining jurisdictions, you may decide to add responses which you didn't think of originally, and questions may have to be adjusted for clarity as you work on your project. And this is something that may seem abnormal the first time doing this. I know when I first did this, I was frustrated because I wanted to figure out the entire coding, the entire question and coding scheme up front. But this does evolve over time. As you learn more information, you're going to want to revisit your questions. And this is really part of the policy surveillance process. So it's important to, I know you want to figure everything out up front, but it's important to give yourself a bit of a break and understand that this is part of the learning process. So moving on. So in terms of how background research leads to developing coding questions, so when you near the end of the background research process, you're going to have a list of constructs that you're going to want to study. So legal constructs are important elements or features of the law that can vary among jurisdictions that you're interested in researching for your project. So you started developing a preliminary list of constructs after writing the policy memo. So once those preliminary constructs have been defined, you can begin writing your questions. So now we're going to get into the actual steps you have to follow to conduct in-depth background research. No. Well, sorry, that was from, yeah.
But basically the idea here is your background research goes directly into your question development. So, and your background memos, when you investigate the legal landscape, that your background memo, your policy memo leads you to identifying the key elements of law and variation, which leads to what we refer to as preliminary constructs, as Marcelo said.
All right. So moving to this next slide. So on the left, you're going to see two laws, and on the right, you're going to see the construct that can be derived from that law. So there's several different ways to generate preliminary lists of constructs. So one of those ways is to compare the elements of the law in each state from your policy memo, and from there you're going to generate a preliminary list of constructs. Constructs are important features of a law that you want to study or capture. And that's just to reiterate what constructs are as opposed to questions, which are more specific, and that's what we're going to get into next. Another way to generate your list of constructs is to work with subject matter experts to find variables that you may have missed in your background research and to identify hot topics for your subject. So this is incredibly important just because even though you may have a very good handle on the area of law that you're researching, it's always good to talk to people that are out in the field and that live and breathe this and work on this every day to help you capture anything that you might have missed. And I'll get into some personal experiences I've had with subject matter experts later on. But it's an incredibly helpful way to develop questions. You're also going to want to do brainstorming with your team. So you're going to want to meet with your research team to come up with all the different variables that you could capture or would like to capture, and hashing out what's important, what's not important, and really figuring out what you want your questions to get at in the long term. And this also helps to develop and refine the scope, which is where we started this presentation. And again, I'm going to remind you here that policy surveillance is about measuring the law and not interpreting it. So as you're working through your constructs and then your questions, it's really about measurement and not interpretation. So we'll move on. So now we're going to do an exercise. So we're going to have you write a list of preliminary constructs. And then we're going to, quote unquote, discuss this list. We'll talk about some of the things that should have come out of this exercise as you do it.
So hopefully you are all able to see that on the page, on our homepage for this webinar, when you go to log in, there were some documents available for you to download. 2 of the exercises that we're going to be doing today were available. So exercise 1 is this exercise. Basically, what we have there for you is a sample legal text of laws surrounding youth traumatic brain injury. And what we want you to do is take a look at that legal text, read through it. It basically gives you an example of the law in that area, and then write a list of preliminary constructs or so of the of sort of constructs that catch your eye, of key elements and variations in the law that you would want to capture in your data set. So take about 10 to 15 minutes right now to do so. If you have an issue with getting the document, please let us know. And otherwise, we'll come back together in about 10 to 15 minutes, and hopefully you have a list of preliminary constructs that we can then visually discuss about. So thank you. Let us know if you have any questions while you go through this exercise. We're going to come back together in about 5 minutes, so keep reading through that sample text of law and listing any preliminary constructs or crucial elements that you're finding in those laws, and we'll come back and discuss them. And if you want to send us your list of any preliminary constructs that you come up with, feel free to send us in the chat box. Just copy and paste it into there if you're typing it up, and then we can mention them when we go through our list of preliminary constructs that we have come up with from the example legal text. Thank you. Another 5 minutes or so. All right, welcome back. I hope you all have had a good amount of time to read through the sample law provided to you. So what we did was we provided to you the law in that sample jurisdiction on youth traumatic brain injury laws. So from there, we wanted to make a list of example constructs that we could base our question development on from understanding that sample legal text. So we're going to go through some of the example constructs that we came up with, some of the ones that you've sent to us. So first, the most basic that we've been suggested is the legal criteria. So this would just be a sort of this question of this is a very basic construct. Basically, the idea of we need to understand what the legal criteria are for the law that surrounds youth traumatic brain injuries. So this would be generally, we could turn this into a question, potentially just a sort of a baseline question about whether there is a law around youth traumatic sports brain injury, or whether the law requires schools to adopt their own policy around youth traumatic sports brain injury. So that legal criteria and the legal structure of the law is an important element, and because it's probably an element that varies across jurisdictions. In our research, I'll give you an aside of, because we've done this project, it really does vary. Some states require that school districts develop their own policies. Some require that the policies be developed by the state legislature and sort of implemented in that top-down fashion. So that would be a good example construct. Some other ones, whether there is a removal from play requirement. That's a pretty basic youth traumatic sports brain injury one. So that would be just, does the law require a student to be removed from play when they have a suspicion of a youth traumatic brain injury? Similar other constructs include parental notification, return to play requirements, so what must happen for a student to be able to return to the athletic field after being removed, who is required to give clearance for return to play, so we could get into details and a variation about who makes those decisions and how. Training requirements is another construct that we were sent as a suggestion. And that's a great one because that's something that probably varies across jurisdiction and is an important element for the implementation is who has to be trained on youth TBI, who health professionals, teachers, coaches, who is required to meet those standards. Return to learn. This is actually, just from experience, this is the area where there's the most recent movement in this area of law, where there are specific requirements for sending a child with a concussion back to the classroom. The research has shown the effects of concussions on actual learning ability, and so now some of these laws are including some of these return to learn requirements in addition to return to play. Again, we also got some more stuff about training requirements for specific people, coaches, health professionals, as I said. TBI information sheets, that's a good one. That could be, you could have a whole question set on what is required to be sent to parents, what kind of information has to go to the kids and parents before they actually even participate in sports at the school. And then another one that someone mentioned was prevention measures, and this is one that there's also been recent movement on. So that's the idea that the law requires civic preventative measures in terms of practice, play time, things like that could impact youth TBI. So those are just an example of preliminary constructs, and hopefully you found some similar ones in your process. And most likely, not everyone's going to come up with the same exact constructs because it's going to be dependent on your scope of your project and dependent on your research and what do you think is important for you to get out of your project. So I can turn it back over to Marcelo to discuss the next step of the question development process.
Great. So the next step of the question development process is finalizing your list of legal constructs. So now that you have come up with a list of legal constructs, we're going to talk about how to finalize those and narrow those down. So you're going to want to narrow down the list of constructs to features that are of interest or importance. So this has to do with your scoping and with the interest that you have in the specific area of law that you're researching. So just to remind you, a construct is a feature of law which can vary from state to state. So this is different than questions. We're still on constructs. So you're going to want to identify constructs that you want to study, and you're going to, once you identify those constructs, from there you're going to want to develop questions from those variables. So it's important to create questions that ask for observation rather than interpretation. This is the theme of this presentation, but it's very important, and you'll see it continue to pop up as I'm speaking. And the reason we do this, the reason we are looking for observation rather than interpretation, is because the goal of policy surveillance is to create data that can be used for evaluation. And it's important to create objective questions that can be coded consistently, and the way you do that is by avoiding interpretation. So when we get to coding, or when you do coding yourself, you will see that if your question is phrased in a way that relies on interpretation, 2 people or 3 people or 4 people may come to entirely different answers. So that's why we're trying to get this to be as objective as possible, because we're trying to measure what's in the law instead of interpreting it. And just to make another distinction, an observation is something that is measurable, whereas an interpretation is a conclusion that we derive from an observation. So these are standard constructs that you see on this table. So policy surveillance uses 2 kinds of constructs in each study: standard constructs and legal constructs. So standard constructs are included in every study and provide information which is helpful for quality control and analysis of the data. So just to walk through what these standard constructs are. So the first one that you see on there is jurisdiction. The jurisdiction is the locality, county, state, or country which is being studied in that particular iteration of the law. And it's important to identify each record by the jurisdiction that's being studied, because policy surveillance seeks to compare the law in different places. So this is your, I guess, space or geographic aspect of your research. Then in terms of temporal constructs, you have effective date. So the effective date is the date at which the most recent law in each iteration of your built law took effect. So built law is the organized and formatted legal text which is used to code. So an iteration of the law is what the law looks like on a specific date. So for longitudinal data sets starting on January 1st, 2000, for example, the first iteration would be on that date. Then if one of the relevant laws is amended later, so say on April 12th, 2001, then the next iteration is going to reflect the law on that date. So the effective date is important because it's going to identify at what point in time a particular record applies to. So this is the temporal aspect, as I mentioned, of your constructs. Then the other 2 that are listed here, the FIPS code and the coder name. FIPS is the Federal Information Processing Standard, which is a unique identifier for every jurisdiction in the U.S. And then the coder name is the name of the person that's coding this particular iteration. And the reason coder name is important is because it captures information that can be used for quality control. So now that we have the standard constructs, which we just walked through, and your preliminary list of constructs, we're ready to develop questions. So in terms of drafting coding questions, these are the steps that take place in drafting coding questions. In simplest terms, you're starting with your preliminary list of constructs and your collected law from your 5 state memos, and then you're developing response sets, and then you're going to turn those constructs and response sets into questions. So another important thing to note that we mention a lot here is that this is an iterative process. Question development is also an iterative process, and the questions and responses are going to evolve as the researchers code the questions, because you're going to find that sometimes maybe questions or answers need more nuance, or maybe they were phrased in a way that's not ideal, so you will come back to them and you will make changes, and that's okay. So in terms of developing the response sets, I'm about to walk you through the process. So you're going to take your constructs, and from there you're going to create responses based on the constructs and questions. So you need to remember that not all states are going to have your responses in their laws. The goal is to create a response set that encompasses all possible options. So not every state is going to answer or is going to have all the answers that you've listed, but the idea is to capture the full range of possible responses that are out there in the law that you have seen. So if you find new responses later, then you can revisit this stage of policy surveillance and add additional answer choices as appropriate. So once you've developed your response set, then you're ready to turn your constructs into questions. So finally, we're getting to questions. So for some questions, the content is going to come fairly easily from the structure of the constructs and the responses. Other questions are going to come from different places. So in terms of converting constructs into questions, while you're converting constructs into questions, make sure that you're writing questions that are going to capture observations in the law as opposed to interpretation. Again, the theme of this presentation. Policy surveillance focuses on features of the law that you can actually observe, and it's not a person's interpretation of what the law does. So you also, this is a very important point, you also want to avoid making compound questions. This is something that I've come across in doing question development. And compound questions can really confuse the coding. So you don't want to ask a question like, does the state have a law restricting return to play or return to play? Return to learn or return to play. Because you might come across a situation where the state might have a law restricting return to learn but not return to play. And then different coders are going to code that differently depending on how they're interpreting that or. So your compound questions really lead to issues in coding later, so it's important to avoid those. And you're also going to want to avoid text-based responses, meaning answers where you write in text based on what you're seeing in the law. So the idea there is to create categorical questions instead, and using coding conventions to try to create a consistent coding scheme. So categorical questions are going to allow for easier comparison between states and also facilitates the analysis and comparison of outcome data. And then just to reiterate, fill in the blank or text-based questions where you're writing in your answers, that is problematic because it's not really usable data when you're doing evaluation because it's not going to be consistent across jurisdictions. So in terms of question types, you will become very familiar with these, as I have. The first type of question listed here is binary mutually exclusive, which are basically yes-no questions. And linking back to earlier in the presentation, we talked about the complexity of law and how complicated it can be. Breaking it down into binary mutually exclusive, does the law capture this, yes or no, is actually a very difficult exercise, but it's actually one that provides people with very clear, very solid information on a very complex area of law. So it's actually pretty remarkable, I would say, and pretty interesting in terms of what policy surveillance provides in terms of value to other people. Another type of question is categorical mutually exclusive. So there are multiple answers here, but only one of the responses applies. And then we have categorical check all of it applies. So there are situations in which a state may meet or may have laws that are captured through various answer choices, and your categorical check all that apply will allow you to capture all of that information. So those are the main question types. And in terms of converting constructs into questions, once you've identified your constructs and identified their attributes, you can begin to construct full coding questions. So for some questions, the content's going to follow fairly easily from the structure of the constructs and the responses. One way to structure questions is to develop questions with multiple layers. So this is something that we do a lot here. So there are 3 levels of questions that we use here at the center, parent, child, and grandchild questions. So the parent question is the highest level question. Child questions are 1 level below, and child questions are conditional on the parent question. And then we have grandchild questions, which are 1 level below child questions, and those are conditional on the child questions. So the parent question can begin with something very broad, asking about whether or not there is a law in place on a specific topic. And then the child question will drill down into a more specific area of that law or of that area that's being captured in the parent question, and the grandchild question does the same thing for the child question. So essentially you're getting more specific as you move down from parent to child to grandchild. So now we're going to move on in terms of subject matter experts. So this is another way to develop questions. So the first way is what we talked about before. It's when you're doing research, you're doing your memos, your 5-state memos, you're collecting a lot of information on your own and coming up with a lot of questions based on your research, which is probably at this point very comprehensive and very solid. But you also want to reach out to people who are living and breathing this content area, who know it well, who have been in the field for a long time, and can help you come up with questions that maybe you've missed if you're just being introduced to this content area, or if it's something that you don't work with as directly as other people do. So in terms of my own experience with this, we recently were working on a syringe exchange project, and one of our content experts was somebody who is the head of a syringe exchange program. So there was a lot of value in reaching out to them and having a conversation with them and having them serve as a subject matter expert, because this is somebody who's actually seeing syringe exchange implemented on the ground and is running a program doing syringe exchange. So they have a sense of what laws are barriers, what laws are facilitators, all those sorts of things that I know nothing about because I'm just here at the center trying to do research. So I also would like to just kind of emphasize how important it is to have subject matter experts for other reasons. It's good to develop contacts in the field because when you move forward in this process, when you're ready to put your information out there, when you're ready to publish your study, a lot of people that you can work with as subject matter experts may be interested in engaging with you once you publish this information, providing feedback on this, and also learning from the policy surveillance that you've done, because I have found in my experience in working with subject matter experts that sometimes they have all of these questions, but they don't have the time to do this type of work or the expertise. And you now, with the expertise that you're getting from these webinars and from your work and in engaging in these types of projects, you can actually provide them with that, which is a huge benefit. So it's really a huge potential for partnership and for working together and really learning more about the field that you're researching. So finally is to capture any unexpected responses through iterative coding. So as you're coding, you're going to find that maybe there are better answers or other answers out there than the ones that you have already written out. So that is the final step in drafting coding questions. And moving to the next slide. So in terms of capturing unexpected responses through iterative coding, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So once you've converted your constructs into questions and have identified the responses, you might begin finding responses within the law, and that's called coding. And coders are going to begin to review the law and find responses that are present at each jurisdiction at each point in time. So as the coders are moving through the states, they're going to find constructs or attributes within a construct that didn't come up in the 5-state memo. And this is to be expected. As I mentioned before, sometimes you feel like you can figure out the entire question set up front and the answers as well. As you begin coding and digging deeper and getting more into the nuance, you're going to find that maybe your questions weren't where they needed to be or your answers weren't where they needed to be, and that's okay. So upon discovering a new response in a jurisdiction, the coders can amend their list of attributes to include an other choice. So when there's a new answer choice that they think is relevant, they can select other and add a caution note to the question explaining what answer choice they found and citing where it is in the law. So by coding it as an other, the supervisor of the project can then review the note and then can decide to add an answer choice to the study. And then once the response has been officially added, the coder will recode that specific question in the state, and other will be removed in the coding form. So now we're going to move on to a game, which we like to do here at the center, because it really solidifies your learning. So we're going to test your knowledge on some of the things we just talked about. So we're going to have you spot the issue with this question. The question is there law that prohibits novice and experienced drivers from driving while using a cell phone? And the answer choices are yes and no. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to identify what the issue is with this question. So if you're thinking C, you're correct. It is a compound question. The issue here is that the question is aiming to capture novice and experienced drivers. So the and may confuse coders, and two different coders may code this in different ways depending on what the law says, because the law may exist around just novice drivers, some just around experienced drivers. So
exactly, yeah. In this situation, you would ideally, if it was important for you to capture the distinction in the law between prohibitions for novice and experienced drivers, you would turn these into two separate questions, which would capture each of those, or you could decide that in terms of your scope and your project that you don't actually care about the distinction, in which case you would just get rid of the specific novice and experienced and just have this one question for drivers individual, or just drivers.
All right. Next question. Why are handheld devices restricted? And I might give away the answer here, but there's a blank here. So, if you guessed A, that this calls for interpretation, then you're correct. There's not an observable feature here, and by having a blank answer choice or one that's text-based, we don't want that kind of answer choice in our data set because it's something that you can't consistently capture across jurisdictions. Yeah,
exactly. This question basically has two related problems with it, where, yeah, as Marcelo said, on the one hand, it's in asking the coder to make sort of an interpretive decision as to why these things are restricted. It maybe in the text there is a specific reasoning or not, but most likely that's not really going to be in the legal text. And then on the other, additionally, it's a fill in the blank, which is going to cause issues in between your coders of having the same response.
All right, so the next question. What is the fine for a first offense? $100, $200, and $300. What is the issue here? So, if your answer was E, that this is a good question, then you are correct. There are no problems with this question. Next question. Is the fine for a violation strict? Yes or no? What is the issue here? So your answer here should be A, because the word strict requires some interpretation. So when I was first learning this, this example really stood out to me. So now when I do question development, I think back to this example just because I think sometimes we use language like strict, assuming that that's clear to everybody. But I know just in coding and in developing questions and then coding, the way that I've worked with some of my colleagues, we have very different interpretations of words, and some of us tend to be oversensitive to those words. Other people tend to interpret things more loosely. So the lesson on this slide, I think, is really to look out for words like strict that actually require interpretation, even though you might not realize that you're doing some interpreting there. So the next question, what are the exceptions in the law? And I'll let you read the answer choices and then think through what the issue is. So if you're looking at answer choice D, then you would be correct. There is an unnecessary response here, and that response is all of the above. So the way that we would structure this question, back to when I was talking about the three types of answers, so this should be a categorical check all that apply question so that you can select more than one response.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't want an all of the above answer choice, and especially in terms of the end result of the data. It's going to sort of confuse things for any researchers using that if there's no actual clear understanding of what all of the above are. Yes. If you're just looking at the data. So we want to avoid that by having this question be set up as mutually as check all that apply categorical. So that instead of an all of the above answer choice, you just select all of the above answer choices.
Exactly. And this might not mean that much to you right now, but when you're looking back at the data and you're trying to figure out what all of the above means, you're going to need to look back at your questions to figure out what the all means. So this can get really confusing. So this is something that I've actually had to train out of myself by working here, because I think it is intuitive to want to do an all of the above, but really categorical, check all that apply is much more specific, and it's really what you want if you're trying to do data-driven policy research. So the next question, what are the exceptions in the law? And I'll let you read those answer choices and come up with the issue. So there should be some flags in some of those answer choices. The big flags are the words and in answer choice 2 and answer choice 3. So the answer here should be B, that these are compound responses. Bus and taxi drivers, law enforcement, and paramedics. So a possible solution to this is to break this out into multiple answer choices, so just bus drivers, just taxi drivers, just law enforcement, just paramedics. But an alternative, something that I've done in my own work here, is to combine them into one answer choice. So you can get creative here and try to find a term that's going to capture these categories. So for example, you could say emergency vehicles instead of law enforcement and paramedics. And that's a good way to capture when there's some variation, but enough that you can create a general category around that. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's important, and that'll come down to your scope, and as well as that'll probably come from discussions with content experts in those areas as to whether it's important to capture the distinction for the exceptions between law enforcement and paramedics, or if we can just capture them as just emergency vehicles. Yeah,
and I actually recently had to do this on a question development set where we were trying to figure out whether to code employees or volunteers, or employees and volunteers, and we ended up deciding on the term staff because some states just use the word employees, some used employees and volunteers. So yeah, this is an important skill to develop when you're writing questions. And this is the last question we have for you. Is there a state law on cell phone use while driving? What is the issue? So if you answered E, that this is a good question, you're correct.
Great question.
So in terms of common pitfalls in developing questions, the theme of this presentation is something that I've repeated, I think, over 10 times now. It's important to observe rather than interpret. And the reason for that, as you all have heard, is because we want something that's measurable as opposed to something that's based on interpretation or our own conclusions. Another pitfall is relying on text-based responses. We know that there's other options in terms of how to frame questions and answers instead of doing the text-based response where you're filling in the blank. And then a final pitfall is not including potential responses.
Which is a thing that'll just happen, most likely, in the course of your question development. It's a pitfall because you're gonna have to deal with it eventually, but it's the reason we have the other response and are able to capture more answer choices as we go through our project, just because from the background research, the policy memos, you might have all of the potential responses that you could know from that research, but as you go through the rest of your jurisdictions, you're going to find things that don't fit.
Some other pitfalls are using too many layers of questions. So we talked about parent questions, child questions, grandchild questions. If you're going deeper than that, it may get too specific, and because as you move down in the layers, child questions are contingent on parent questions and grandchild on child, it's going to get very complicated. Also, compound questions and responses, as we just did in our examples, can lead to some coding issues, and then unnecessary responses like all of the above can also be problematic.
So we're actually running kind of short on time here. So for this exercise, we have provided with you a blank question development table. So this is the table that we use when we are going through our question development process. As you can see through the example, we've filled out the beginnings of it for you, and the idea here is that you can use the preliminary constructs that you came up with through the sample legal text in exercise 1 to start developing questions and response sets about specific features in the law from those constructs in an actual question development table. We right now, you should, if you want to, you should feel free to take some time, potentially right after this this webinar, to do that yourself. Also, you can also just use the blank QDT as a basis for your own projects if you wanted to do this with an area that you are working on now. Feel free to develop your own question development table. We are also, as I don't know if I've mentioned it in some of the other presentations, I haven't mentioned it today, but we are here to help you if you have your own policy surveillance project, your own question development table that you want to create based on these trainings, based on our process. We do technical assistance for lots of outside organizations and researchers who are developing their own question sets, and one of the main things that we do is review QDTs and give our feedback on how to structure those questions, things that we could change just from a strictly structural aspect, not even from an actual material and subject matter area, but more on our making sure that the questions are well written and structured in a way that will produce good data. So right now, instead of giving you this time, since it's almost noon already, we're just going to go through what our QDT for this project, our project specifically on youth traumatic brain injury laws, looks like from the same sort of sample of laws that we provided for you. So here is how we would start off with our QDT. As you can see, we have basically a general parent question that captures whether or not, at a basic, whether the state law specifically addresses youth sports TBI. If we answered no here to this question, this is a sign that we're not going to answer any of the rest of our questions. We usually, in the construction of our data sets, we have sort of this threshold question for every data set, the kind of, for each jurisdiction, we'll be able to have a simple yes or no binary response if there are any requirements as a yes, and if there are not as a no. And the no's here will signal that all the rest of the answers are going to be no, so we don't even really need to go through the rest of them. But from here, you can see that we sort of structure the rest of our questions in a way by topic. So we have a question on whether the law requires the removal from play, whether there must be notification. So these are all based on those constructs we discussed earlier. So whether there's notification of the parent or guardian, are there specific return to play requirements, and then we go into child questions from there onto what those specific return to play requirements are. So is clearance from a health professional required? And then specifically, we have a grandchild question here of whether that health professional needs specific traumatic brain injury management training, and then whether that person needs to be a medical doctor. We go back to general requirements for return to learn policy, and then go into child questions for the specifics of that policy, as you can see here in 8P and 9C, how they're related to each other. And then we have a number of questions about, we have a coach training question, and then a series of questions related to TBI information sheets, who must receive it, who has to sign it, and then we go into another parent question on preventative measures. So basically the idea here is you can review this QDT, we can send it out with with the recording as well to look at what our question development table for this topic would look like, and you have a blank one that you can use to fill out yourself and compare if you would like, or fill out in an area of a project that you plan on working on or are working on. So back to Marcelo to finish up our question development process.
Sure, and we've just got a few slides left, so bear with me. So I'm going to tell you about the Codebook. So the Codebook is a complete list of all the questions that are coded in a legal data set. So that's going to include your question type, the variable name, and then the values of those variables and their labels. So the Codebook, along with the data set's statistical data, can be used together for evaluation. Another piece that I'm going to tell you about is the data file, and the data file includes all the responses for the legal data set across all jurisdiction and points in time. So it includes the start and end date for each record, a statistical tab with the responses only, a summary tab with all citations and caution notes listed, and the statistical data can be used for evaluation. and its numeric format lends itself for overlaying with outcome data. The summary data can also be used for quality control or to quickly view the full data of the legal data set, including citations and caution notes. And then finally, you can use the codebook with the data file, and you can identify variable names and values from that. So in summary, so the steps in question development are to develop response sets, to convert constructs into questions, and then capture unexpected responses. So we're done for today.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to send them along now in either the chat or the Q&A feature. Otherwise, thank you for joining today in our part 2 of our presentation on the advanced webinar series. Please keep in touch as we see here. Here's our email, our phone number, our website. Again, our website has all of our previously created database that we've done in-house here, including, as we've just said, the codebook and the data file are freely available there, as well as the research protocol, which has the details of our question set, and all of those publication materials we publish with all of our data sets. So they are all freely available for you to look at. As well, again, we are here to help if you are working on any policy surveillance projects on your own. And we will be here for part 3 of the advanced webinar series on October 8th. We are going to be going into the next step, which is collecting and building the law. So basically, now that we have gone through scoping your project, conducting your background research, as well as developing your coding questions, we're ready to move on to collecting the actual law and the actual legal text that you're going to use in court with the questions that you develop to answer those questions so that you can have this data in the end. So in our next session, we're going to be talking about the details of research in that regard and how we go about researching and collecting the legal text itself, which will be very exciting. So please join us then, October 8th in 2 weeks from now. And we also will be sending out the recordings of these webinars, most likely tomorrow. I think it takes 24 hours for the recordings to process. And if you have any questions, feel free to be in touch. Otherwise, we are finished with this webinar for the day. So thank you all for joining. I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday.